Picture this. You are 22 years old. You are sitting in a classroom inside an unmarked building. A senior service instructor walks in, not to scare you, but to brief you. He runs you through the polygraph orientation. He shows you the photographs of intelligence officers who have been killed in the field in the previous 12 months. He puts your fingerprints, your DNA, your photograph, and your full identity into a system that will track you for the rest of your career. This file, he tells you, is for the service, so that if something happens to you, if you go missing, the agency will know exactly who you were, and the operation will know exactly what it lost. You are 22. You did not fully understand what "if something happens to you" meant, but you understood enough to know it was not abstract. And then orientation ended, and you walked into a station environment where the cohort of officers you were joining had recently buried 3 colleagues, and waited for somebody to come back and tell you what the work actually looked like. This was the foundation, the actual operating reality behind the experience. If you joined the intelligence trade between approximately 2002 and 2015, you came up during one of the biggest doctrinal shifts in modern intelligence history. According to multiple verified post-incident reviews and the post-2004 community reorganization documentation, the number of operatives assigned to the CIA's Counterterrorism Center and its counterparts across the community more than tripled between 2001 and 2008. Tripled. Over the same period, the operational tempo measured by flagged threat actions per analytical product rose at a rate the agency had not sustained since the early 1950s. The result? The cohort that joined the trade in your years became one of the most operationally pressed groups in the history of Western intelligence. That is not a small group. That is nearly the entire mid-career layer of every major Western service. And here is what gets lost when people talk about this. The cohort effect did not just hit the officers who joined right after 2001. It hit the operatives who joined in 2005, 2008, 2012 just as hard, and in some specific ways harder, because by the time you got to your first foreign station, the doctrine that had been forged in the early years was no longer a debate. It was the operating environment. It was not unusual. It was Tuesday. A 2014 internal review of Counterterrorism Center officer well-being described your cohort as having gone through its formative operational years as one of the most threat-saturated, least institutionally insulated officer generations in modern agency history. Threat-saturated, least insulated. That was not an attack. That was a description of your Tuesday. A 2008 Government Accountability Office review documented that officers in this cohort were operating at sustained tempo levels that had previously been associated only with wartime deployments, not because the senior leadership was cruel, because the targets were not patient. Now, what did those operational hours actually feel like? Research on cohort officers in this period is consistent on what those hours felt like for the first 5 years of service. Cognitive load, hypervigilance, and threat anticipation are the most documented states for officers in the first 5 years of service. Not burnout, not disillusionment. Cognitive load, hypervigilance, and threat anticipation. Think about what that actually meant. You are 24, 25, 26. You walk into a station that is operationally quiet on the surface, but that quiet is not peaceful. It is the quiet that comes with knowing the targets are working at the same hours you are. The cable traffic is constant. You read the morning indicators not because you want to, but because if you do not, the gaps in your situational picture become operational liabilities. You figure it out. And here's the part that does not get talked about enough. A lot of you were not just operating at high tempo, you were also expected to mentor. By your 4th or 5th year, many post-9/11 officers were already running junior asset relationships, training new arrivals, and shaping operational planning for case officers who had been in the trade for 30 days.
You were 28 years old, managing pieces of operational responsibility that in the pre-2001 service would have been assigned to officers 10 years your senior. And when the 0600 briefing finally happened, the answer to "how was the night cycle" was fine. Because what were you going to say? Now, you might be thinking, okay, but officers adapt. Officers are resilient. And that is true. But here's what makes your specific operational experience different from any other high-tempo intelligence cohort in modern history. You were operating at this tempo precisely while the public was being told the threat environment was unprecedented.
Here is a sequence of events, all verified, all real. In September 2001, the operational center of gravity of every Western service shifted overnight to counterterrorism. In 2002, the public discovery of intelligence failures preceding the attacks generated a sustained pressure on operations directorates that had no precedent in agency history. In late 2002, Cofer Black, the former CIA Counterterrorism Center Director, testified publicly about what the agency's operational culture had been required to absorb in the previous 12 months. Black's famous line about wanting the targets brought back with flies on their eyeballs entered the public record as a marker of the operational temperature at the working level. By 2004, the 9/11 Commission Report had become the document every officer in your cohort was expected to have read, internalized, and be capable of operating in response to. Schools at the agency restructured their curriculum. Tradecraft instruction added entire modules on counterterrorism doctrine. The polygraph reviews tightened. The continuous evaluation programs expanded. Public service announcements told the country to see something, say something. And if you joined the trade between 2002 and 2008, you were in your first 5 operational years when this saturation was at its most intense. The period when professional habits get wired in. The period when the operational environment forms its shape in your mind. The pressure got into you. It was built to. And then, at 1800 hours, you went back to the station for the night cycle. That is not a small thing. That is being told every morning that the threat environment was uniquely lethal, and then being expected to manage your portion of it for the next 16 hours with the institutional support of a service that had not yet finished restructuring itself. Your cohort absorbed the message that the operational world was full of patient adversaries, and your cohort was then placed inside that operational world at sustained tempo for most of your formative years in the trade. That is not weakness. That is what it looks like when the most threat-saturated cohort in modern intelligence history gets handed the operational pile and is told to handle it.
Now, fast forward. The first wave of operational pressure is behind you, mostly. You were a mid-career officer, and the operational picture is still complicated. If you joined in 2003, you were 33 when the Snowden disclosures landed in June 2013. Between 2010 and 2014, the operational environment for human intelligence collection inside hostile services shifted in ways that are still being processed. The counterintelligence cost of the disclosures was significant, and it landed on the cohort that had been operating in the field. That was not abstract. That was the network of relationships you had built being suddenly visible to the very services you had been working against. And at the same time, you were being trained in something no cohort of officers before you had been trained in at scale. Information operations could compromise an asset just as effectively as a contact failure could. Your tradecraft instruction was updated. The message was direct. The digital surface existed. It indexed. People died. And you needed to know. The post-Snowden disclosures shaped a cohort's understanding of operational survivability and the limits of institutional secrecy. If you joined in 2006, you were 30 when the WikiLeaks Vault 7 disclosures happened in March 2017. You watched the technical infrastructure of the trade get publicly disclosed. lost specific operational tools, and had to rebuild collection methods from scratch. You were not watching this as a trainee. You were watching it as a mid-career officer figuring out who you were and what the service was. And what you saw was the operational world is complicated, the threat saturation, the doctrinal upheaval, the constant operational tempo, the institutional restructuring around you, the cumulative pressure of operating during a period when the agency itself was being publicly contested. Take all of that and ask, what would an officer who came up in that environment do as a senior service member when they had their own junior trainees?
When post-9/11 officers became station chiefs and division heads, the pendulum swung hard. Hyper-mentorship, anxious oversight of junior officers, often erring on the side of being protective of their team's operational identity in ways that some senior officers from earlier cohorts found difficult to understand. You became the protective leadership tier, the ones who track your officers' digital footprints, the ones who insist on debrief support, the ones who could not stomach the idea of your juniors feeling the same operational isolation you had. And here is the thing that makes this clear-eyed in a very specific way. Officers from earlier cohorts sometimes characterize this protective posture as institutional overreach, and technically, in some debates inside the trade, they are within their rights too. But they have no full context for why you are this way. You were told the operational world was the most lethal place an intelligence officer could be deployed into. Then you were left to handle it without the institutional infrastructure that was being built around you in real time. You swore at some point, maybe consciously, maybe not, that your trainees would never feel that particular kind of alone. A retired senior service officer captured this in a single line in published reflection. A hyper-mentor was an under-mentored officer. That is not a therapy quote. That is a description of cause and effect. You experienced something, it left a mark, and you responded to that mark. That is just how people work. Here's the honest summary of what your training environment made. You came up being told the threat was uniquely lethal. You were placed inside it before the institutional architecture had caught up. You learned to manage assets before you were old enough in the trade to have been managed properly yourself. You sat with the operational isolation of working on targets that the rest of the service was still learning to articulate. You watched institutional restructurings, public-facing controversies, the Snowden cascade, the Vault 7 disclosures, the public legitimacy debate over the trade itself, and you developed a healthy suspicion of anything that sounded too settled or too certain. Officers from your cohort are typically described as resourceful and operationally independent, traits partly stemming from your saturation-era entry, as well as keen on maintaining operational hygiene and personal sustainability, perhaps due to witnessing what the demands of the post-9/11 tempo did to the senior officers above you who did not get to manage their own load. That is the polished version. The real version is you figured out that you were mostly going to have to do the work yourself, and you got operationally fluent at it. And you did something else, too, something quieter. You paid attention to what you did not want to repeat. The senior officers who had been too remote. You tried to be present differently. The institutional environment that felt operationally unsupported. You tried to give your junior officers something more grounded. You overcorrected in some institutional debates the way every operational cohort does, but the impulse was real. You were called the most threat-saturated cohort in modern agency history. You turned around and decided you were going to mentor differently. That is not nothing. That is the whole thing.